Hello and welcome to this panel discussion and webinar on the future of global legal education. My name is Arjya Majumdar and I'm the Dean of Admissions and Outreach at OP Jindal Global University. And today I'm joined by a distinguished panel of higher education leaders in law schools from across the world. Let me begin by introducing our panel members. Professor Anne Davies is the Dean of the Oxford Law Faculty and Professor of Law and Public Policy. She studied at Oxford, completing her BA, winning the Gibbs and Martin Ronker prizes and the DPhil. She's the author of 5 books, Law and Labor Law. Professor Davies gives lectures in labor law for undergraduates and teaches the BCL MDRA course in human rights at work. Professor Brenda Hannigan is the head of the Southampton Law School and professor of corporate law. She received her MA from Trinity College Dublin and her LLM from Harvard University. As a company lawyer, her research interests lie in the nature of the corporate entity, its purpose, and the power dynamics within a company, especially the relationship between directors and shareholders and between minority and majority shareholders. Professor Austin Parrish is the Dean and James H. Rudy Professor at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. Dean Parrish received his bachelor's degree from the University of Washington and his law degree from Columbia University, where he was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar. Over his career, he's taught a variety of courses, including civil procedure, constitutional law, federal courts, transnational law, international environmental law, and public international law. Professor Eduardo Penalver is the Alan R. Tesler Dean and Professor of Law at the Cornell Law School. He received his BA from Cornell University and his law degree from Yale Law School. Between his college and law school, he studied philosophy and theology as a Rhodes Scholar at Oriel College, Oxford. Dean Penalver's scholarship focuses on property and land use, as well as law and religion. His work explores the way in which the law mediates the interests of individuals and communities. Professor Marc Miller is the Dean and Ralph W. Bilby Professor of Law at the University of Arizona College of Law. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School and Pomona College. Dean Miller writes and teaches about environmental law and policy and criminal law and policy. He's the author of more than 70 articles and essays on a wide range of environmental, criminal justice, immigration, and legal theory topics. Lastly, Professor C. Rajkumar is the founding Vice Chancellor of the OP Jindal Global University and the Dean of the Jindal Global Law School. Professor Kumar has academic qualifications from the University of Oxford, Harvard University, University of Hong Kong, University of Delhi, and Loyola College, Chennai. Professor Kumar is an accomplished legal scholar and works in the fields of human rights and development, comparative constitutional law, terrorism and national security, corruption and governance, law and disaster management, legal education, and higher education. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all our panelists on board. The future of law around the globe is changing, and the landscape of the legal profession is expanding exponentially. And the demand of lawyers in all societies is increasing. In a post-COVID-19 world, it is anticipated that the legal fraternity will have huge demands on its expertise. Now, this is not going to be sector-specific or country-specific, but could well be a transformation seen across continents. Uniform in its law schools in a completely new discipline to decipher. After all, there are no laws and regulations to deal with in a global pandemic or its aftermath. But the coronavirus should give law schools an opportunity to set a template. It is in this context that we find it imperative that leadership in law schools globally take cognizance of this unprecedented, new, and challenging demand that this profession will face. To take up a role in anticipating, articulating, and influencing what will be the dramatic changes in the legal profession in the decade and beyond. Let me start with Professor Marc Miller. Professor Miller, there is an inherent belief that the pandemic has changed the face of legal education forever. With the advent of technology and online learning, the legal education may never be the same again. Will the online learning and hybrid teaching models be the future of this relatively conservative discipline? And how are you preparing for this change?
So thank you, and I think it's useful and interesting to have this conversation around legal education, but I do think it's important that we put it in the context of changes to higher education and education more generally. The impacts from the coronavirus are pervasive, certainly from the standpoint of a US university. The impacts at the university level dwarf the immediate impacts and even issues raised in the law school setting. And if we were having this conversation 4 months ago, I would still have answered that technology is fundamentally changing the legal profession and legal education, and that needed to happen. US regulations have been a bar to US law schools moving to digital formats and to more creative formats. But the section of the ABA that regulates law schools is step by slow step moving along, pushed by law schools, including the US law schools represented in this conversation. So before the coronavirus, in terms of the change in the way we do legal education, who we teach, how we teach, when we teach, what the subjects are, the tools we use, I think that change was taking place. I do agree with the premise of your question, which is since all US law schools have gone fully online, albeit in synchronous format, not with the kind of careful planning and use of digital materials that we see in other contexts, that the openness and I think the pressure to move farther down that road will continue. And so I expect the regulatory barriers to fall, and I expect law schools around the world to begin to use these tools in more thoughtful and planned out ways, I think for the good of all in terms of access, education, access by non-lawyers to legal training. I view not the coronavirus, it has nothing good to say about it, but I view the changes you're asking me about in legal education as generally optimistic and positive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Professor Miller. Let me just quickly turn to Professor Anne Davies. How are UK universities, and Professor Brenda, please feel free to jump in at any point of time as well. How are the UK universities dealing with this? Is it similar to the US approach?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, there was a mute button showing up. So I can't speak for all UK universities, and obviously Brenda will speak for herself. I mean, obviously in Oxford, the immediate challenge has been to move our teaching and examining online for the upcoming term. That has been a challenge, but an enjoyable one, like all challenges. And obviously, there are going to be some long-term lessons that we will learn from that. I think it's a little bit early to say what those are going to be. And I think it's also important not to sort of try and draw a big contrast between online and in person. One's better, one's worse. I think they're just different and doing different things. And I think there's lots of scope for hybrid models in the future. So I'm looking forward to seeing what new opportunities this creates for us. And I think, you know, the particularly exciting and obvious one is the possibility of bringing some aspects of an Oxford education to a wider audience around the world without people necessarily having to come to Oxford to get it.
Right, wonderful. Professor Brenda Hannigan, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's been obviously a very rapid transition. We've only been in lockdown for a month, so it has been quite challenging to move an entire law school and university online in that time. And as Anne said, we're just starting a new term, so the initial challenge is teaching, but very shortly the main challenge will be assessment that we would normally be expecting to examine in May, and I think that's one of the areas where it's quite likely to lead to lasting change once we have assessed entire cohorts online this summer. That's likely to be something that we might persist with in the future. But I think going back to what Marc said earlier, that yes, we have these immediate challenges presented by COVID-19, but in any event, law schools legal curriculum, how law firms work, etc., have all been changing very rapidly because of technology changes. So in some ways, the COVID-19 crisis is, I think, probably just going to accelerate how we respond to those changes, but not necessarily, as Anna said, in a bad way. There may well be very good opportunities which will come out of this.
Right. Thank you very much, Brenda and Professor Marc. I'd like to weigh in on the curriculum that law schools have adopted across the world, and in particular, let's say, clinical courses. Do you think that there would be significant alterations in the way clinical courses, which ideally require a large amount of in-person teaching, which require a lot of hands-on experiential learning, that which might not be available to students in the near future? Professor Austin Parrish, would you like to consider answering this question on clinical courses and the curriculum of clinical courses?
Yeah, so I think I'm sort of in the, it's a little too early to tell on how things are going to play out. Currently, our clinics are operating in an online remote way, and are doing fairly successfully, but I think that's only a short-term solution. Over the long term, I think they are going to need to work out ways to do, for many of them, they're going to need to work out in-person client interaction just because of the nature of some of the work they're doing. I think the bigger question here is perhaps less the public health emergency in the short term, but rather, if that continues for a long period of time, the economic pressures that it places on universities. And I think those economic pressures that are placed both on law schools, universities, and law firms, those could be more fundamentally altering depending on how long the pandemic goes for. I'm cautiously optimistic that once we get past a certain period of time, I think there's going to be a demand, at least in the clinical space, for us to return to in-person as much as possible because of the benefits of in-person there, even though it may well be that this immediate need to go online has made faculty in a range of areas more comfortable with remote teaching, and therefore I suspect we may see more hybrid approaches, as Anne was saying, being as useful tools for being able to reach clients and teach. But I suspect in the clinical mode, most of it is going to occur in person if that becomes possible.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Parrish. It's significant that you mentioned the economic pressures that universities and law schools and higher education in general will be facing, or hopefully will not be facing, if this were to continue. Are there any significant alterations that leadership at the top law schools are anticipating right now? Let me ask this question to Professor Eduardo to begin with, and then we can open it up to the remainder of the panel. So, are there any significant alterations that we're anticipating in the discipline of law in itself?
Well, I agree with Austin. I think that, for us, the biggest challenge is the short-term financial challenge, caused by the uncertainty about enrollments in the fall, our ability to have in-person classes in the fall. We haven't made any decisions about how we're going to restart, and that's subject of active discussion right now. And so the range of possibilities is pretty broad, and the financial consequences of that are, range from mild to extreme, but they're all short term. So, I see the challenges as really transient in that sense, and the challenge for us is to kind of get through it with as little structural damage as possible, and to come out on the other side as strong as we can be. And so it's very different than the financial crisis 10 years ago, where, I think it sort of called into question some of the basic assumptions of legal education, at least the aftermath of it did. This doesn't, right? And so I think, we're looking to absorb the blow, but not change any more than we have to. And so we're continuing to plan to hire faculty, and we haven't kind of shifted our models in terms of how many students we want and how many students we think we can responsibly graduate. So those kinds of things, which we were actively discussing 10 years ago and even 6 or 7 years ago, I think are not really triggered by this crisis. This crisis is one that we have to just survive.
Right. And I understand that it's more of a short-term survival question rather than a long-term.
That's how I see it. I mean, it's 12 to 18 months. Let's get through it. Right.
Well, we're all going to be very hopeful, and let's hope that we do all get through this in the next 12 to 18 months. This is a question open-ended, of course, for the entire panel, and a number of you have been talking about. We've been talking about the economic pressures in terms of student recruitment and the financial position of the universities. Have you made any changes to the admissions process this year to overcome these economic pressures? Professor C. Rajkumar, let me start with you and then perhaps go on to others.
Well, first of all, I think there is clearly a fair amount of uncertainty surrounding the entire process, particularly in India. For example, the Indian law schools admit students on the basis of entrance examinations, and most of the entrance examinations have been put at a standstill situation. So from that standpoint, there is some degree of uncertainty. But I do share many views expressed by the panelists here today, because I think it's also important for us to recognize that there is going to be a lot of resilience for us to overcome this crisis. While we will overcome this crisis, it is also important for us to recognize that there is going to be more and more acceptance of some of the things that we are already doing in relation to respond to this crisis. For example, I think, at least from our standpoint, we never thought we will begin with an online master's degree in law program. For at least the last decade of our existence, we were just reluctant to do that. And now we realized that there is enough number of interested people around the country and beyond who might be able to pursue such a program. So there will be certain elements of legal education which will go through a tectonic shift that will be triggered because of the crisis. But I do believe that a lot of the fundamental things that we are doing in law schools will remain, and that is the question of what is going to happen for the next 18 to 24 months. Before we began this panel, we talked about the hopefulness in which many of us are, living, in the sense that when I look at Anne Davies, who's the Dean of the Law Faculty at Oxford, we are hopeful that the Oxford scientists will come up with the vaccine at the early so that we can overcome this situation.
Thank you very much, Professor Raj. I'd like to ask the same question now that you've mentioned Oxford. I'd like to ask the same question to Professor Anne Davies. And we already have a couple of questions from our users, from our audience on shifting to the UK and taking up higher studies there. Have there been any changes in the student recruitment process for Oxford?
So in terms of our undergraduate recruitment, we had already completed that process before the pandemic broke out. Obviously, we're waiting now for students to get their exam results, and for UK students, at least, that will be a rather different process this year. But that process is continuing unchanged. In terms of postgraduate recruitment, we're just doing that at the moment. So we're working our way through the many thousands of applications that we've received. Obviously, I'm sure that applicants will have many questions about what's going to happen in October, whether we'll be open for business in person, whether there might be some sort of staggered start, whether there might be social distancing measures still in place. And of course, like everyone else in the world, I can't answer those questions at the moment because none of us know, and we have to be guided by UK government guidance and advice and legislation. So obviously, our ideal scenario is that we are back to business as usual, because whether through the ingenuity of Oxford scientists or through some other measures, the virus has been addressed. But of course, nobody knows what's going to happen. The challenge at the moment is that what we intend to do is provide an outstanding Oxford education to anyone who accepts a place with us, whether that's going to be in person or online for some of the year, or even in the worst case scenario online for the whole of the year. We're thinking through all of those options and thinking about how we can do what we do online and continue until such time as we can get people back in Oxford in person.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Professor Davies. So we've moved from the immediate reaction that law schools have had around the world. We've talked about what changes, if any, they're doing to their admissions process. I now want to move on to a very topical and current and contemporary issue that, or set of issues that are currently around the world. Now, it is expected that in a post-COVID world, the demand for lawyers will be more to provide legal solutions to the healthcare system, perhaps human rights issues, insurance markets, workplace laws, property laws, and so on and so forth. Similarly, there have been cases of Zoom bombing and fake news and cyber frauds, which we will only see more of as we go along. These would create more interest in, for example, public health law, cyber law, privacy data laws, amongst others. Now, I'd like to ask of Professor Marc Miller again, how do we readjust, or how do we provide the necessary tools or skills to lawyers who might be interested in solving these kind of problems that are cropping up more and more as we go along? Professor Marc?
Sure. So I'd like to answer that by transitioning from the last set of topics we talked about, because here I think I may disagree with the other panelists. I see this as a world historical event. I don't think we will return to the normal. Even I share what everyone has said about admissions in the fall. We're wrestling with the same issues. The University of Arizona has announced that it intends at least to run in parallel live, and believes at this point we have the science to do it, subject to external constraints. But in terms of what we will teach and the demand, all the topics that were just framed, cybersecurity, privacy, the demand for advice in health and health systems, have been major growth areas, again, well preceding this. We found our students who do even fairly modest work in cybersecurity or privacy law have on the market. That has resonated broadly, both in private and public employment. But I think not only will this vast set of issues be highlighted by the coronavirus, but the need for professional education, the need for training in non-lawyers on some of these issues by legal institutions, sort of the demand for and interest in these things will extend way beyond our traditional LLB or JD students, or even our master students. Raj mentioned the movement at Jindal towards more online in the master space. Again, that's training. If it's a LLM of lawyers, we're finding a massive increase in demand pre-coronavirus for training in health fields, for example, by non-lawyers. And I think that will dramatically increase, since we all function in highly regulated and legalized countries and systems. And part of what comes out of coronavirus will be more regulation and complexity, international, domestic, local, and so forth.
Professor Marc, I'm glad you raised the issue of international complexity, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But I'd like to take Professor Brenda's take on this in terms of, you've been working with company law for a number of years, and there seems to be considerable demands from large corporates across the world. I know of a few of them in India, and of course in the US, where a certain section of people are looking for these various lockdowns to open up. Now, in terms of advising these companies in terms of their responsibilities, are we equipping our students well enough to deal with these challenges of social responsibility, perhaps even in terms of insurance law and cybersecurity?
Well, I think I think Marc's point a moment ago about how we're all working in regulatory environments. I think the crisis will, when the immediate health crisis subsides, it will have identified the extent to which practically every step that society has wanted to take at the moment has had to be driven by a legal framework. You know, can you test these unknown vaccines on individuals immediately? Can you overcome regulatory constraints on who can produce ventilators, etc.? And in the corporate sphere, what you see at the moment, you see some businesses like Amazon being under a lot of pressure, for example, in France, where there's been a societal concern that these businesses are not treating their employees in a way that's consistent with a regard for their safety and well-being. You also see other businesses, for example, some of the high-end luxury businesses have rushed to shift from, say, producing perfume to producing hand sanitizer. From producing, you know, ludicrously expensive clothes to producing face masks and so on, because they sense that there had been in any event, but there is an increasing focus on what is the purpose of these corporations. You see some countries like Denmark, for example, are refusing to give state aid to businesses which have seen fit to base themselves in tax havens and not contribute to the Danish exchequer. So I think you're going to see quite a focus as we return to some version of a new world economy, which will expect more from companies in terms of social responsibility. To return to the question of how this impacts on legal education, well, I suspect all of us would say that any of these issues would be reflected in our curriculum in any event, because we expect our curriculum to be up to date, to be addressing current issues, to be, for example, focusing on very significant human rights and ethical questions, such as the provision of medical care to people in need. So in that way, I don't think there will be changes to the curriculum in our law schools, but I think there will be a flight to quality in the sense that what prospective students will be looking at will be, you know, where are they going to get rigorous, demanding, high quality, high standards of legal education to equip them well to get into a marketplace which is going to be significantly different, I think, for law graduates. We mentioned in passing there about the global economy, but I think, for example, we see law firms, even very significant international law firms, facing significant challenges now, economic challenges. So how they ride them out will be interesting. And then, of course, that filters down all the way down through the legal firms. And just one final point, which is in relation to also the court system. The court system has more or less moved online very rapidly in the last month, which we would have said, you know, even 2 months ago, we said, oh, that can't be done. And so it will have an impact on litigation in the future. So I think there are lots of ramifications which will only become apparent probably in the coming 12, 24 months.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Brenda. It's interesting that you raised the issue of law firms and courts. We've seen what the 2008-2009 recession did in terms of. I'm sorry. We've seen what the 2008-2009 recession did for the legal industry. Now, a lot of people, it is believed that we're already in the middle of a recession. Is there anything in particular that we are doing in terms of our legal education and preparedness of our law graduates to prepare for the recession that has already come about? Let me pose this question to Professor Austin Parrish.
I think there's some very short-term things that we're doing, which is that in a difficult economy, you need students to be thinking more creatively about how they interact with legal employers. And I think certainly in the short term, you're going to see a stop of hiring, or at least delayed in hiring. And so preparing students or recent graduates for how to handle that, I think, is important. And so there's a lot of sort of triage going in right now on advising and sort of thinking about how they launch their careers. I think over the longer term, I think it's still a little too early to tell. I think we are going to see some firms that will not be able to survive in the short term, and others that have the wherewithal and the structure to be able to do that. Whether that leads to fundamental adjustments or not, I think is hard to tell. And I think we'll have more to do with what happens with the economy over the next 6 months to a year, and where the demand is. In some ways, and this sort of parrots on things earlier said, we are seeing firms that have strong demand in the employment labor area, in the counseling advising area. We're going to see an increase in the bankruptcy restructuring area for the short term. And then you're right, in the immediate short term, litigation has been slowed dramatically because of the readjustment of the courts. And how that's going to play out, I think, is sort of a wait and see approach. For the longer term, I think it's probably things that most of the deans on this panel are already doing, which is that I think you're going to continue to see greater emphasis not just on the substantive areas of law, but on understanding how the legal profession develops and how careers are made over a longer period of time. And I think that will have a global aspect to it. I don't think that's necessarily created by the COVID crisis or created by the economic crisis that may come from the pandemic. But I think this is what Professor Hannigan said earlier. I think it's an acceleration of those trends. And so, I think if you're looking forward, it's going to be important for us as schools to think through how we educate our students, not just on the law itself, but on the business of law in the way that it interacts with students are prepared for the ability to adapt and be mobile in a fairly rapidly changing sort of set of circumstances. But I think we've got to be a little careful that it's still early to tell what the implications of this are. People are having difficulty predicting even when we're going to be out of the pandemic mode. And I think the time that takes could fundamentally alter what the projections are going forward. Is this a 6-month problem? Is this an 18-month problem? Is it a couple-month problem? That's going to radically change, I think, the impact on the employment scenarios that are available for our students and for the change in the legal market more broadly.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Parrish. I'd now like to move on to perhaps the last sort of broad theme of our panel discussion, which is the internationalization and globalization of education. Now, this has been a very significant part of a holistic education experience, not just at the Jindal Global University, but for all of our partners across the world, including law schools that are being represented on this panel. However, there will continue to be, at least we expect, there will be continuing travel bans that will severely affect student mobility over the next 12 to 18 months. Now, what I'd like to ask the panel is this, that are there ways in which we could still create a culture of globalization and internationalization in terms of legal education across the world without having to physically mobilize students to move from one country to another? Let me start with Professor Anne Davies, and then we'll go on to other panel members.
So I think it's a mixed picture, isn't it? So obviously, as you say, we're going to lose the opportunity for significant travel in the near future, which will limit things like student exchanges in person. But on the other hand, what this webinar illustrates is that using technology, you can get people together from all corners of the globe and get them having a conversation. And I think now that we've realized these possibilities, then there's potential for that sort of collaboration with other institutions around the world. So plenty of options, I think. Thank you. So plenty of opportunities, I think, for students to hear maybe from fellow students and from professors in other universities that they might not have been able to come into contact with quite so easily in normal times because the ability to just get people up on the screen and have a seminar. So I think it's it's different, but there are some potential good things as well as bad things out of that aspect of the crisis.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ann Davies. So, Professor Penalva, as Cornell Law School, one of our many university partners, how do you see student mobility, particularly in the United States, getting along in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, it's a real challenge, not just internationally, but even nationally. I mean, we're hearing from students who, are reluctant to come from the West Coast, or who are reluctant to come from Boston because they want to be close to family at a time like this. So the international borders certainly present an additional challenge. You have national policies, I think, that reinforce that, at least from our country, that kind of turning to sort of nationalistic responses to the crisis that are going to make things more challenging. We're in the midst of right now a 60-day immigration, I don't know what to call it, from our president that hopefully won't interfere with the new academic year, but is certainly sends a message to the world. So those are challenges, but there are lots of, I think, as Ann was saying, lots of solutions for people to connect, even with those challenges. Before all this happened, we were having joint clinical classes with Jindal, where we had students there and students here participating, working together on clinical projects that culminated in some travel. At some point, you wanted people to get in the same room, and I don't think that there's really a substitute for that. But there are certainly ways for us to be engaged with one another over great distances using this technology. And I think one of the things that this crisis has done is increase people's comfort with participating in a panel like this.
Right, wonderful. So, Professor C. Rajkumar, I'd like to ask you a very country-specific question. Now, Indian students, as well as I think students from China and other parts of the world, they would prefer going to, a large number of them prefer going to the United States, the United Kingdom for higher education, whether it's in the form of an entire degree or perhaps a student mobility program such as a semester exchange, short-term study abroad, etc. Now, with travel restrictions in place, how do you see aspiring Indian or Chinese students reacting to this travel advisory, particularly in the light of their higher education aspirations outside of their home countries?
Yeah, well, this is a very major challenge, no doubt about it. I do believe that we all need to recognize the importance of student mobility and internationalization of higher education and how it has impacted quite positively legal education. Having said that, one of the things that law schools around the world and even universities are thinking as we speak is that to what extent we can, let's say, retain the character of internationalization in a world which is going to have lesser mobility, at least for the next 18 to 24 months. How do you have internationalization with lesser or no mobility? And that's a very important question which we need to answer. And I think it's one of the ways by which at least we are preparing ourselves for it, is that to what extent we can create opportunities for our students, working with our partners to pursue, let's say, pathways program. Maybe if they were supposed to go in fall, delay that and have an online presence. I know that unique programs are being, let's say, conceived. A very distinguished academic from University of Arizona, Professor Brent White and Marc and others are working on a program which will mean American universities are creating pathways for students abroad to spend a certain amount of time, or at least for the next 1 year, pursue programs back home and then delay their coming into the United States as well. And we have just signed a very important agreement with the University of Arizona, which will enable us to host Arizona enrolled students at our campus. So there are innovative ways by which we can promote, let's say, the vision of internationalization in a world which is going to have lesser mobility. Having said that, I think it's equally important for us to be engaged as an international community. And as Anne mentioned and others mentioned in the panel too, these opportunities that we are creating for our students, for our faculty in the form of webinars and others should expand. And I think the connectedness that these things bring together with fair amount of reluctance in a pre-COVID world will become more and more common. I also want to mention that I think students in particular need to be told about the need for developing resilience even in the face of crisis. So one of the things I know for sure the graduating students, not just at Jindal, but also around the world, will be facing is that the jobs that they had or have been given may get delayed. Offers might be withdrawn, or joining dates may be deferred. They will have to reinvent themselves and find different types of career opportunities. And this is a time when the fundamental values of education that they have received, including knowledge and skills and analytical abilities and sense of reasoning, all those things will help them and carry them forward for the future, even though they will face temporary adversities as the crisis has created. So in a way, we need to empower our students, enable them and make them understand that this crisis will be overcome, but this is an opportunity for them to remain strong and be resilient about the future.
That's a very hopeful message from Professor C. Rajkumar. Any final comments, ladies and gentlemen, on the internationalization and globalization of legal education before we move on to questions from the audience?
I wouldn't mind weighing in if I could, just briefly. I think it's also worthwhile keeping in mind that all of our institutions, we're not just focused on the education of students, which is really critical, but we also all have very core research and advancement of knowledge missions, as well as service missions. And I think what this sort of webinar illustrates is the ability to collaborate internationally and globally. That has not ended in many ways, at least the kind of research that most of our institutions are doing. And so I think that actually provides greater opportunities for us to do more collaborative research. I think Jindal's been a leader in this for many, many years. And I know we run a Stewart Center on the global legal profession, and I think they're busier now than they've ever been with their outreach to others around the world. So I think that sort of global research component that is a core part of most of our missions is going to continue unabated and strong. And I think it's important to recognize that that's equally important as the education mission. I do think the service mission of the schools are changing, but that too, we're able to provide tremendous support to state, local, and national governments and others through our advancement of knowledge, even if some of the live client services that are done through our clinical programs are on hold. And so I mentioned only sort of the broader vision of the university and the law school that all of us, I think, have in our missions. And although we're right now very much focused on the student mobility side, some of those other things, aspects of our mission are thriving well. And I think particularly from the schools that we see on this panel, the leadership that has been taken in the past here will continue by places like Jindal and Cornell and Oxford and Southampton and Arizona.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Professor Parrish. We're now going to move on to questions that have been posed by our audience, who've been asking questions ever since we've started, and there's a sizable amount, and we're going to take some of them. We're not going to have the time to take all of them. But let me start with one from a gentleman by the name of Ridhiman Mukherjee, who says that this might sound extremely vague at the moment, but since I am about to take up law in college, I wanted to ask you, are lawyers born with profoundly gifted abilities to speak, or can they be created via a proper legal education? I think this is a question that a number of people are asking in terms of, how does one actually become a lawyer in terms of being able to address an issue effectively? I'm happy to have anybody on the panel address this question.
I'm happy to come in on this. I think none of us would think lawyers are born. I think we would all be of the view that if you come to law school with the requisites meeting the requisite entry requirements, and you bring intellectual curiosity, drive, and determination, then you can be a very successful lawyer.
Wonderful. I think that's the sentiment of the entire panel here, given the number of nods and smiles all around. But so that's general advice for a budding lawyer who's listening in right now.
Well, I would just add to that there are so many. There's a stereotype of a lawyer. I think when I was 7 years old, the pediatrician said that I was bound to be a lawyer because I was so argumentative. But the range of skills required to be a successful lawyer are very broad, and there are so many ways to practice law that don't involve having a silver tongue. There's a lot of research and analytic thinking involved that can be done by someone in a back office and who never really wants to engage in a courtroom or directly with clients. And I mean, there are just many ways to excel as a lawyer, and many different kinds of skills that can produce a successful lawyer. So you're not born a lawyer, but obviously people have different aptitudes, and some skills are more amenable to teaching than others. But I don't think there's any one type, and certainly not the stereotype of the lawyer that many people bring to law school. So I would just encourage you, if you're a little introverted or not really great at public speaking, to think that there may be other ways to practice law, or you can try to learn to overcome those limitations. But there's a lot of room to grow, and law schools play a part of that. But it's really a personal journey as well.
Right.
I just want to weigh in on this, Arjya, because it's a very important question. I know a lot of students across who are listening, but also others may be asking this question because, listen, I think for many of us in the panel, but also faculty members, we decided to study law because we believed that there is a deeper sense of protecting the rule of law and to have a sense of contributing to justice. Today, when we have so many forms of injustices and inequalities prevailing in our own societies, I do believe that lawyers, or those who want to aspire to study law, one of the things that they should be concerned about is that they might want to devote some part of their life towards contributing to that justice. And I think that remains one of the fundamental motivations for a lot of people who want to enter into law, and that actually differentiates law from, let's say, a career in business studies. I have no disrespect for people who do MBAs and study in business schools, but if you are wanting to study law, you better be having sufficient conscience to pursue a life where you are engaged in speaking truth to power and to contributing towards justice.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Raj. I'm moving on to a very specific question directed at the US law schools. And Sukriti Agarwal is asking, do you believe that US citizens would be given more importance during the employment process by US law firms? Now, this is obviously a question coming out of our earlier discussion on student employability, particularly within the context of a recession. Now, I was at Tulane in the United States in 2007, while the 2008-2009 recession was sort of looming on the horizon. Could I ask either Professor Marc Miller or Professor Austin Parrish or Professor Eduardo Penalva to address this question? Would you believe that US citizens would be given preference over non-US citizens in terms of employability by US law firms?
So I'll jump in quickly on that. I'm sure we'd all have comments. There's really at least two and maybe more dimensions to that question. And one, it has to do with US immigration law. So for non-citizens, the barriers to getting an H-1B or other status that allows them to work in the US have gone up. And so if we can assume for the moment you're talking about someone who has an immigration status that allows them to work, then it will turn enormously on what the private firms are looking for. And if we're right that certain global legal demands go up, it may be that someone with dual training could see an advantage. But for a lot of US firms, it depends on what sort of work they do now. We found about 20 to 25% of our JD students at Arizona are non-US lawyers who've come to get the JD. So not LLMs, JDs. And for them, a large number go back to their home countries, a large number want to stay, and many do and work. And what we found is an increasing awareness and support for people with dual legal training among US firms, but it's varied enormously by the nature of their practice. It's a slow change, and this could affect, and we've already talked about this, it's likely to affect legal demand as a whole in ways we can't fully predict. And exactly how that will play out against the particular background and expertise, I think it's very hard to say.
Right. Professor Eduardo, would you like to address this question as well?
Yeah, I would agree with that. About 20% of our JD class is international. Some of them are already permanent US residents, but many of them are not. And I've seen a diversity of comfort levels among employers with navigating the complexity of the immigration process for graduating lawyers. But the way I would generalize is that large firms, especially large global firms, are pretty comfortable with it. I don't think that they would really distinguish or between U.S. citizens and non-citizens. They have global offices. We've had situations where graduates, had a job offer, didn't get the H-1B, and then had to just start their career abroad, and then were able to get the visa the second time around and come back. So, and large global law firms can handle that without too much trouble. So. Large firms, by and large, have been, I think, comfortable with it. I think smaller firms are still kind of learning, so are somewhat less comfortable with it. But we haven't had, like with that 20% of our class, we haven't had significant job placement challenges.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Penalver. I have a question from Krishna Dolny, which goes back to our earlier discussion on globalization of legal education. And she asks, will the emphasis on the globalization of legal education reduce somewhat in the face of increasing nationalism, or in the face of increased screening for crossing borders? Now, could I request Professor Ann Davies to address this fairly pertinent question?
Sorry, there's something very strange going on with the muting and unmuting here. I mean, I think from our point of view in Oxford, we see ourselves as a global law school, but we're also a preeminent English law school. And so for our undergraduate body in particular, we're looking to provide them with an excellent grounding in our national legal system, plus some opportunities to look at international law and comparative law and other subjects. And I don't see any plan to change that. Where we can really sort of let rip on more global emphasis is at the postgraduate level, where we have a wide variety of taught graduate courses with lots of different options, and obviously doctoral students pursuing a huge range of research projects, many of which are comparative and involve fieldwork in other jurisdictions and so on. I don't see any of that changing, really. I think the students are going to want to experience different cultures. I find it really hard to see how that could disadvantage anyone in any way, shape or form. It brings lots of rich benefits, even from the point of view of getting a better understanding of your own system, because you've seen what someone else's system looks like. So I mean, I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think there's going to be a sudden rise of nationalism in legal education. Of course, that may be a bit of optimism bias on my part, because I very sincerely hope that doesn't happen, but I genuinely don't think it's going to.
I just want to add that it may be possible that during these times, it's quite natural for people to think a little more domestically, and there may be different types of protectionism that has the risk of coming to the forefront. We have seen that happening, although I must say that if there is one constituency in the world which is resisting that type of petty nationalism, is actually the universities and law schools. Universities are fundamentally, committed to the ideas of global engagement and knowledge sharing and partnership and collaborative endeavors across, borders, and they're benefited richly by that, collaborative engagement. So while policies relating to immigration and other types of jobs and things like that will constantly pose threats to make institutions look inward, I do believe that the inherent ability of universities to resist these notions of pettiness and petty nationalism and misplaced myopic ideas will once again make institutions, universities and law schools provide leadership. And that's exactly what we need at this moment, because we will overcome the crisis that this disease has posed. But what we should not enter into is a situation where the mindset and the attitude and approach towards building a collaborative engagement that institutions have for a long time nurtured, that should not be compromised even during this time.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Raj and Professor Davies. I have a question which goes back to our earlier discussion on student recruitment. One of our audience members, Mr. Nishit Desai, says that he secured admission in a prestigious US university to start his LLM starting this fall, and he's from India. He asks whether it makes sense to defer it to next year, considering the economy and the recession situation, which would exist when he graduates. Could I ask Professor Austin Parrish to take this question up, please?
Sure. I think this is very much a personal decision as it relates to the person's own sort of career ambitions. I don't think delay is going to make much sense. It's hard, at least historically, to be able to predict when the market's going to come back and when things are going to change. And so it could well be that within a year, it's the best time to be entering the legal market. It could be not. It's really hard to predict. So I think the question is really, what's the other alternative that you're doing? If you're sitting at home and you're in a stay home and you're not able to do anything else, then frankly, even an online approach at a law school is probably more productive to move your career along. And if what we're really worried about is the economic consequences of the pandemic, it's pretty clear that additional credentialing, while it may not get you the same jobs that you were able to do before sort of an economic crisis, certainly positions you in a better place than if you don't have those credentials. And so it's very clear in the last recession globally that people with graduate degrees and LLMs or JDs or LLBs were better positioned those that didn't have it. And I think that's certainly not going to change. So I think it's very much a personal decision as it relates to your own family and your own situation and your own financial situation. But putting those things aside, I think generally trying to time the market is really difficult. And so my suggestion is, unless there's a really good personal reason to delay, it's usually better to go forward, because at the end of the day, if there is difficult times, you're better off with a higher credential, all things being equal.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Austin Parrish. I have a lot of questions regarding the pathways in law, or the specializations that one may take up in law. One particular one that says that after the pandemic gets over, what would be the best job for a law graduate? A lawyer working in large firms or a lawyer specialized in cyber laws? To which the standard answer usually is that go where your heart takes you. But I'd like to ask Professor Brenda Hannigan this question as to what do you think would be the best option for a law graduate graduating in, let's say, 2020 or 2021, working in a large corporate firm, or a lawyer that is specialized in cyber laws, perhaps?
Well, I think we touched on this earlier in the sense that we mentioned about the wide variety of jobs which are available to lawyers. So you know, it's not an either or. There will be a multitude of job opportunities for law graduates, you know, and whether you, so there are different pressures in very large firms. We can see very large international firms are under quite a lot of financial pressure at the moment. We've already heard that, of course, even before this situation, there was a huge demand for lawyers in cybersecurity and data protection, etc. So it comes back, I say, in part to what is your personal preference, but also what's your personal aptitude. And actually, it then comes down to who's hiring. And I think for the next 12 months, quite possibly there's not going to be a lot of hiring. But really, I think people should be driven by their ability and their interest rather than, you know, setting out abstractly to say, I think all the jobs are in cybersecurity, so that's what I'm going to do. You might find that that's not the area that you've got strength in. You might be much better as a lawyer in, I don't know, public international law. So look to your strengths and what your qualifications are, and then try to match that to the job market rather than abstractly thinking, I will go for a big firm because it's definitely better. I say the big firms currently face plenty of pressures.
Right, thank you very much, Professor Brenda. I have a question that goes back to a point made earlier regarding research and law schools collaborating on research. In this day and age, when we're more connected than ever before, in terms of, you know, this panel being across 3 different countries, across 3 different continents, what can law schools do to promote more research collaborations? Let me start with Professor Marc Miller.
So I think there are many things we can do. Every one of the US law schools represented here has engaged with both faculty and students at Jindal Global University as an example. But one of the fundamental puzzles in creating faculty level research partnerships is you really have to find and build alignment in interest. And you can't manufacture those partnerships. You can't do that domestically within your own institution. You can't do it internationally. So to me, this in part goes back to the earlier question about the pathways for students, because if there are active partnerships, right, if there is a reason to go and spend time when we can get back on planes to speak in this setting, to engage with others, then the conversations among faculty and often among interested and bright students who are driven to do research naturally leads to deeper research partnerships. But I think a lot of the efforts and the sort of an older form of partnership where we will work together or we will do research together across institutions have not in general proven to produce much substantial output or content.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Miller. Professor Eduardo Penalva, would you like to weigh in on this question as to what can we do more in terms of our research collaborations?
Well, I agree that the best collaborations are these organic collaborations that are built on relationships, and again, that's why I think, you know, being in the same room is so important. You know, forging those friendships and relationships is what really yields ongoing and strong collaboration. Whether that's domestic or international, right? I mean, it's important for us at Cornell Law School that we be in the building, that we be able to walk down the hall and see our colleagues, and we get a lot of collaboration out of those informal interactions. And I think the same thing is true with global collaboration. But I think there are things we can do institutionally to foster those relationships, right? We can't force it, but we can encourage it, and by investing in it. And so by providing faculty with resources to go visit at Jindal, to have scholars from Jindal coming here and speaking and visiting at Cornell. We have a wonderful partnership with Tel Aviv University that we've had for many years, that started out, it was a little, you know, started out sort of top down with the law school in collaboration with some philanthropy, you know, sending scholars to to Israel, and we have every year visiting scholars from Tel Aviv University who are teaching at the law school, and it started out like that, but over time the interaction yielded collaborations that now happen outside of this program, right? That I'm learning about just from informal contacts that faculty members have made with one another, and joint scholarship that comes out of those interactions. So I think you need a little bit of both. You definitely, the most successful collaboration happens because of relationship, but we can encourage it by investing in it, by investing in people being together.
Right. Given that research is at the core of research are the people who are doing it, it makes sense. I have a question directly for Professor Ann Davies. Professor, could you please throw some light on the relationship between law and policy? Can they exist without each other, or is one absolutely needed for the other to survive?
So that's a reference to my job title, I suppose. So I work on a variety of areas of public policy from a legal perspective. So things like government contracting, delivery of public services, and also lots of issues in the employment sphere. So my job title sort of fits what I do. I think there are lots of intersections between law and policy. The crucial things are that in order for governments to do what they want to do, they need to put that into some kind of lawful form, whether that's through legislation or through a contract or whatever. Equally, the law plays a role in regulating and checking up that the government is doing what it's meant to be doing and not doing other things. And that's where something like judicial review in the courts would fit in. So those are the principal interactions between the two spheres. For me, the interest lies in seeing what's going on the ground, things that are making a difference to people's lives, but seeing that through a legal lens. So that's the kind of scholarship that I find interesting and rewarding.
Right, thank you very much. We've got a number of questions that are asking about deferring their admissions to US universities and UK universities by a year. Any quick reactions on that? Let me ask Professor Parrish first.
Again, I think it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the next couple of months. And so I think many of us will have more information in the next month or two as to whether we're in person with a hybrid approach, whether we're fully online. And I think there's a lot here that has nothing to do with the universities or the law schools, but has to do with the governments and their immigration policies and the travel restrictions. And so I think my first advice is to hold on for a little bit and see what happens in the next month. Are we going to see peaks in certain areas, and then what's the health prognosis going forward? Second, I think it's very much a personal decision as it relates to somebody's own career path and their timing. Again, it depends what you're trying to get out of this. If it's more of the cultural experience, which is really important, then it may well be that you say, look, I want to defer because what I'm really getting out of this is the time spent in another country. Just like our students, when they go to Jindal, the experience is as much learning the law, but as it is the entire experience of being there on the ground and interacting with faculty. That said, I think I'd be cautious about putting one's life on hold for too long. You're still going to, I think for all the universities that we're talking here, at least, you're still going to get a very high quality experience, even if it has to be online. And that may well be the better route in order to get that advanced degree and to continue to move forward in your career path. And so the idea of putting that on hold for a long period of time just to see what might happen may not be the wisest decision. But this is very individualized to the individual person. I would recommend that you be in contact with the university that you're planning to attend and be comfortable about what the options are. I suspect that in the fall, for those schools that do have to start online or delay, it's still going to be a high quality product, particularly if you're talking about schools that are of the kinds of quality that are here on this call. If it's other places, then I think you want to have a comfort level that the quality is where it needs to be.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Professor Parrish. Professor Marc Miller, I have a question for you. Is global legal education a reality or just rhetoric, when in reality only domestic laws apply in terms of a particular jurisdiction? So in other words, I think what the audience is asking is, what's the point of having a global legal education when we're going to be practicing laws in a particular jurisdiction?
So I think one both correct but somewhat traditional approach to this was the earlier comment that learning other systems gives insight into your own system, that comparative studies are helpful. I actually think it goes way beyond that. We found that the interest and demand for learning and working across borders or into systems is in fact vast and has hardly been scratched by elite institutions of the kind reflected here. Eduardo talks about Cornell, our two schools, and Austin, I don't know the percentage of JDs who are international lawyers coming to Indiana, but 15 years ago, no US law school would have talked about having 20 or 25% of its JD students being trained as foreign lawyers. We've found massive interest. We have 400 current students in a program in China. It's actually growing to 500 because the demand has been so great, the quality, the pathways then into advanced study in UK and Australia and the US. Much higher percentage of those graduates, duly trained to spoken languages and to legal languages, get into elite programs than their Chinese law only trained counterparts. And so we found the interest here is vast. Now, what do those graduates do? Well, if they come to get a JD or continue on, they might work in either country. Eduardo talked before about international lawyers who stay in the system, but they also, finding many of those graduates go on to advise both public and private entities about US and international law, about how to, it may be in terms of negotiation, it may be in terms of various kinds of public policy. And so our experience, we're opening a campus in Hanoi. We have 20 some odd students studying for our BA in law, which is unique in the US at Phnom Penh. We have found more or less infinite demand. Raj Kumar has mentioned the new partnership with Jindal. We see this in part as responding to the lower mobility right now, but really as creating a base to expose and respond to what we believe will be extraordinarily high demand among strong students in India, some of whom will indeed come and follow the more traditional mobility paths down the road. So our experience in terms of demand, intellectual engagement, and outcomes is that the idea that law is local doesn't in fact describe the world we live in, and certainly not the one we're heading to.
Right. Professor Miller, I'd like to stay with you for a moment. It's interesting that you mentioned legal education as a pathway to other countries and other programs. Isn't it true that that the University of Arizona has one of the few, or perhaps the only, undergraduate program on legal studies? Yeah.
So it's not. So other U.S. universities sometimes do legal studies, which are often non-lawyers talking about the role of law and lawyers in the United States and elsewhere, and some have pre-law programs. That's not uncommon. But ours is actually the first BA in law in the country. And what we mean by that is that we train them in what you think of as the core competencies, knowledge, and skills that come in the JD program. And we believe we've created a whole new category of legal professional in the US. The outcomes from that program suggest that's true. About 40% are going on within 2 to 3 years to graduate legal studies, but the majority are not. They go into business, government, other kinds of graduate study. It's been a pathway for massive diversity, one of our goals in the profession at the U of A. So the significant majority of those students since the founding of the program have been diverse and female, and a significant minority first generation students. That outperforms, if you will, pretty much every law school JD program in the US. It's been extraordinarily fun for my colleagues to be teaching undergraduates, and for us, that has been a fundamental change. Now, it allows global partnerships because everyone on this call and watching presumably is very familiar with law being primarily an undergraduate degree around the world, and the US is an outlier, not alone, but in a very small subset that treat law as a professional or graduate degree only. And so we've broken through that. We have about 1,400 students in that major. 200 of those are fully online, 400 in China, a good 800 here. It's been glorious and is growing dramatically, and others should do it.
Well, others are already doing it, Professor Miller, and it might interest you to know, and perhaps you already know, that the Jindal Global Law School is launching its 3-year BA in Legal Studies. Professor Raj, do you want to shed some light on the inspiration behind this in India's first and only undergraduate program, a 3-year undergraduate program in law?
I think there has been a very long and arduous debate in India about the idea of legal studies to be pursued after high school or should be doing in a graduate manner. UK has historically had undergraduate legal studies after high school, and US, of course, has its JD program for those students who have completed another degree. India traditionally had, a 3-year LLB, which we continue to have, and over 3 decades ago, we also began to have the 5-year integrated law program for high school students to enter into law. But both those programs primarily were looking at people who had pretty much decided that they were to commitment to the legal profession and what their has been. And this is a program in particular is the fact that there are no points. You make a choice just after high school and you study for 5 years, and you pretty much you have to pursue that. So we were deeply inspired by the University of Arizona's BA Legal Studies, and also having traveled across India, we felt that a lot of young people are thinking about studying law, but are not sure about the fact that they want to become a lawyer, that they probably might end up using the knowledge and skill sets that they learn in the study of law and can be transferred to many other professions and walks of life, including other pursuit of higher studies. So, and I personally, I've always believed that law is the new liberal arts, law is the new humanities, and law is the new social sciences. And if it is the case, then there is a stronger argument to be made that we need to provide this opportunity for students who may want to study law as an undergraduate 3-year program. And if they do want to become a lawyer and enter into the legal profession with a stronger commitment, they can come back to doing the JD or the LLB in our own country. So that's the vision, and I'm grateful to Marc and the University of Arizona for making this happen for us.
Wonderful, thanks, Raj. There's a direct question for Professor Penalver with regard to scholarship opportunities. And the question is, will the scholarship opportunities remain the same at the US universities in the post-corona world, especially for Cornell?
So can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood. You cut out for just a second in the middle.
Sorry, must be a technical mistake. So Professor Penalver, the question is, will scholarship opportunities remain the same at US universities in a post-corona world, especially Cornell?
So by scholarship, I'm assuming you mean financial aid and not research.
That's right, yeah.
Yes, I would say that's right. Yeah, we're not, like I said, we're not making any real structural changes in response to the virus. So we're modeling things out about the same way, and our budgets looking forward are steady. And so yes, I would expect the same access to financial aid scholarships in all of our programs. If anything, a little bit of an increase.
Thank you very much, Professor Penalver. Is that the same for Oxford and Southampton? Let's start with Professor Hannigan.
Yes, at the minute, to say we are still continuing on the basis that 2021 we will proceed as we had envisaged. But of course, as we've been saying throughout the call, we're only 1 month into this lockdown. And we've got to look at lots of issues as to how this is going to pan out. So at the moment, we're simply, trying to get this term underway and get assessment and get this year's class of finalists graduated. But for the moment, yes, we're proceeding as before, but everything changes from month to month now.
Right. I have another policy-related question, so that can only go to Professor Ann Davies. And Rohit Nair asks, how can a law graduate find a successful career in financial public policy making?
I think one of the things to think about is whether you want to pursue any additional study as well as your law degree. And there are lots of interesting public policy programs around the world. In Oxford, we have a great Masters in Law and Finance, which many people get a great deal out of. It's a great course. So one thing to think about is whether you want to do some additional training. Another thing to think about is whether you want to try and get some work experience in that area. That's obviously going to be a very personal matter, what options you've got available to you. But I think the important thing to bear in mind is that a law degree, as someone was saying earlier, is a great general training for a variety of careers. Many of our graduates go into, for example, government legal service and have really interesting and rewarding careers in that area. So I think, look for examples, maybe look at alumni of your school. What have they done? See what networks are open to you, what experiences you can get in that area, and read around the subject, find out as much as you can, do your research. But remember that your law degree is a good general training for a wide variety of different careers.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Ann. We're almost out of time for today, and we've got another 5 minutes. So I'd just like to take a moment for all the panelists to put in any closing remarks if they would. Let me start with Professor Miller.
So thank you so much, and this has been interesting and always wonderful for me to have the opportunity to learn from my colleagues. I would go back to where we began. This would have been an interesting conversation 4 months ago, and some of the themes we've discussed would have been highlighted then. I think it will be a fascinating conversation a year and 2 years from now, but we are in the midst of this quite extraordinary moment. And one of the themes that's running through is not only the uncertainty, but just how profound, at least for me, how profound the impact of the coronavirus may be on economic systems, on government systems, certainly on higher education. It's an interesting window to look through legal education, but the impacts are so dramatic at the university level that is dominating and shaping it right now. And I think we'll see the echoes and learning and evolution in law over actually a somewhat longer period of time. You've heard from all of us that we're admitting for the fall and largely staying within existing structures. I suspect that's true for other schools as well. So a very interesting moment to have this conversation, and I just want to say thank you for including me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Miller. Over to you, Professor Parrish.
Let me echo the same as what Marc was saying there. I do think this is an exciting time. I'm grateful for this sort of opportunity to talk. I think these sort of, cross-country collaborations and thinking about how things are going to change are going to become increasingly important. So I commend Jindal for organizing this and continue to do these kind of cutting-edge programs. I can't resist. I have to say, Marc has an amazing BA in law. We had a BS in law, and so there are other sort of projects out there that are doing exciting things. I think what we're going to see in the coming years is the innovation in schools, thinking about ways to innovatively take advantage of changes that are occurring. I'm a little more skeptical that we're going to see a massive fundamental reshifting of legal education as a result of COVID. I think we're going to see more an acceleration of trends that were occurring earlier. And I think within that, the core components of our missions, striving towards excellence and high quality education, high quality research, and showing how in policy and other ways that schools make a difference in their local, state and regional and national and international communities is going to become increasingly important. And so I think the leadership that we see for some of the schools that are on the call today are going to become increasingly important in a world that maybe not so much fundamentally restructuring, but continuing to evolve rapidly in a way that we've seen, but maybe perhaps continue at an accelerated pace. But anyway, thank you so much for inviting me, and I've enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Austin, for being here. Could I move on to Professor Brenda Hannigan for closing remarks, please?
enjoyed this opportunity as well to engage with my colleagues, but also with our audience. I think I would just emphasize 2 points. One really is about this, getting away from this idea that law is domestic. I think that has been the biggest change in the last 10 or 15 years, that law has actually ceased to be domestic in many ways because of the movement of people. When you think about it, there's a lot of travel. It's not just business travel. There's a lot of movement of people to live in different countries. There's a lot of international commerce. Consumers that now expect to buy goods from China and have them delivered tomorrow morning, etc., etc. So national boundaries and law as a national jurisdiction becomes less critical every day. So I would encourage everybody in our audience in particular to remain international in outlook. The other theme that has come about has been whether or not people should defer their studies. I think we are all going to be in various stages of lockdown for quite some time to come. So this is the time, actually, particularly for young students, to be thinking about how they can use the time productively. And one of the most productive things you can do is, of course, to continue to develop your CV and continue to seek out education opportunities. They will only enhance the career options open to you and your employability as the economy improves. And so I would encourage you all to continue to pursue your studies. And thanks very much to Jindal for this opportunity to engage with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hannigan. Professor Davies, any concluding remarks?
Just a couple of small points. So very much along the lines of what others have said. I mean, the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford is very much open for business. It might look a little bit different at the moment, but we're still doing our thing, and we're still looking to provide an outstanding legal education, and also to make a contribution through our research to the problems of coronavirus and to the other problems that the world faces. So we are going to keep doing that, even in these very different and extraordinary circumstances. It's been a great pleasure to participate in the conversation, and it's always lovely to see that this group of law schools around the world has more in common than we have as differences, I think, and that's always a nice thing to see, isn't it? And I suppose I just wanted to conclude by saying that in the grand scheme of things, law schools and legal education are not the most important thing in a global pandemic, and I just want to wish everybody in the audience well. I hope you can stay safe and take good care of yourselves in these difficult and dangerous times. And thank you very much to Raj and colleagues for the opportunity to join in with this webinar. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Davies. Over to you, Professor Penalva. Any concluding remarks?
Sure. Well, I would like to just add my thanks to Raj and to you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's been really fun. I would, following up on that point about doctors, I think in a global pandemic, first you call your doctor, eventually you call your lawyer. And that's why I'm so optimistic about our graduates' prospects. Things are slowing down right now. Everyone's kind of in a holding pattern, but eventually things will restart. And when they restart, but as we've seen throughout this crisis, law is engaged in every aspect, right? Whether it's, restructuring practices or, someone sent me an email yesterday about someone suing Columbia University for a refund of their tuition. Well, there was a lawyer filing that lawsuit and a lawyer defending that lawsuit, and so lawyers everywhere, and we're sort of the glue of social structures, and so no matter what the future holds, it's going to involve lawyers, and so the work of law schools will remain relevant. They never, include us on these sort of post-apocalyptic scripts. The lawyers are not at the center of things. Always the doctors and surgeons who get all the glory. But anytime there's a social organization, you need lawyers. And then the final point I want to make is that I just echo the comments that we will continue to be internationally engaged. Global engagement is going to continue to be crucial. I know there are these forces of nationalism that were there before the pandemic and that are trying to take advantage of the pandemic. But I mean, we're all, we're sitting here on 3 different continents, and we're all experiencing exactly the same thing. And because the challenges that we face are global challenges, whether it's climate change or the challenges of global business or the pandemic, we're all in this together, and so we need to be engaged with one another, and that's true at both in public health context, but also in legal contexts. And so I think it's really a remarkable conversation that we've had, and it gives me a lot of hope for what the future holds.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Panellists. It's interesting. We must ask Jerry Bruckheimer to insert a few more lawyer roles in his next disaster movie.
It's not sexy, but it's important.
All right. Final concluding remarks from Professor C. Rajkumar.
Well, let me first say that how delighted I am and all of us are to be part of this wonderful panel, because all the 5 deans who are present here are very close to our institution, and we have deep admiration and personally received tremendous inspiration, starting with Oxford, which is my alma mater, and of course friends across, Sital Kalantri at Cornell Law School, and of course Dean Penalver, Austin and Jay Krishnan at Indiana, Marc Miller and Brent White at Arizona, and of course Brenda and Southampton, which is also a partner. So in a way, I'm extremely hopeful of the possibility of both institutional partnerships raising to this occasion when we have similar challenges to address. One of the things that all of us have learned during this experience is that even simply sharing of experiences makes us understand how all of us are dealing with these issues in a very interesting manner. Many of us might have had views about, let's say, online education before, but we have, reinvented ourselves as an institution, and the fact that we could share those experiences not only through these forums but also beyond gives us opportunity to be hopeful. On a more note about the future of law and legal education, I'm quite sanguine about the fact that lawyers will play a very significant role, not only because of the fact that these issues that pandemic type situations are going to create, but there will be a very important role that lawyers will play, which is to be able to speak truth to power, and in that process determining the nature and context of the future exercise of power across all institutions. And that role will be played by lawyers, and I think it's only fair that crises of the kind that we are talking about today will only recognize an institutional aspect of law as a very critical area of social organization. And that's one of the things which the students can be sure of if they are aspiring to study law. So with those words, I want to particularly thank my friends and colleagues who accepted our invitation to be part of this with different time zones. I didn't think it'll work out so well, and I'm very happy that it did. And so please be safe. And while we will, as a Dean's Committee, collectively entrust the responsibility of getting the vaccine organized to Dean Ann Davies, since she's sitting at Oxford and very close to the scientists who are working on it. With those words, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Raj. And thank you so much for the panelists for joining us today. It's in different time zones, as Raj pointed out, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm sure the audience has had a wonderful time asking these questions and having them answered, and having a lot of their doubts in terms of their career options, their study abroad options, and their mobility options answered. With that, thank you also to all the attendees that came on board. I'd just like to remind everyone that we will continue the series of panel discussions by the Jindal Global Law School. On Saturday, 2nd of May, the Global Judicial Colloquium will be held on the theme of rule of law and access to justice in the age of uncertainty. This will be chaired and moderated by Professor C. Rajkumar, and the session will have 2 sitting judges from the Supreme Court of Hawaii, the Judge President of the Eastern African Court of Justice in Tanzania, the former President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, and the current Governor of New South Wales in Australia, as well as a former Judge of the Supreme Court of India, Justice Arjun Sikri. With that, thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you to the attendees who attended this webinar. I hope you're all home. I hope you're all safe, and I hope that you'll all stay really healthy. With that, we call this webinar to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.